They make cocaine. They have cocaine factories. They grow all sorts of crap that's drugs, bad drugs coming into the United States.
At exactly 4 a.m., when most of Chicago was still hidden under a cold blanket of fog, the sky suddenly shifted. What looked like distant thunder turned into the low, growing roar of rotor blades. Within seconds, 23 federal helicopters locked onto a grid of warehouses, freight yards, and logistics hubs scattered across the south and west sides of the city. According to early reports later confirmed by the Department of Justice, this was the opening strike of Operation Steel Flood, a coordinated assault involving more than 1,600 FBI, ICE, ATF, and state agents targeting cartel strongholds embedded inside the nation's supply chain. From above, the city looked like it had been placed under a targeting reticle. On the ground, armored vehicles pushed through fog-covered streets, while tactical teams sealed off rail lines and warehouse alleys. What investigators uncovered was far more serious than a street-level drug ring. As federal briefings would later reveal, the group operating inside these facilities functioned like a paramilitary logistics network, using reinforced steel warehouses, lead-lined containers, and long-haul trucking routes to move narcotics and weapons with military-style discipline. The real shock came from how quickly authorities struck. How did the government know exactly where to hit? And why did they move with such precision in the earliest minutes of dawn? The answer traces back to months of surveillance, hidden sensors, and a federal trap set so quietly that even seasoned cartel operators never saw it coming. The moment the clock hit 4 a.m., that trap slammed shut. If you want to follow every hidden operation, every secret tactic, and every breakthrough in America's shadow war against organized crime, make sure to subscribe to Military Power. For months, the investigators quietly shifted their gaze to America's heartland, and what they discovered was startling. Under the veneer of Chicago's industrial freight corridors stood a sprawling logistics hub built by Los Zetas that operated more like a military outpost than a drug ring. In warehouses that dotted the city's train yard districts and container terminals, the cartel had laid the groundwork for something far bigger and more sophisticated than simple street-level smuggling. Drone cameras deployed under cover of night recorded 18-wheelers rolling through freight gates with no manifest, containers being moved under floodlights as though preparing for deployment, and cold storage bays filled with goods unmarked and unflagged. What looked like legitimate trucking operations masked a network so entrenched that it might have been a battlefield staging area rather than a clandestine warehouse. The evidence kept piling up. Container racks, semi-trailers fitted for long-haul transport, and freight yards repurposed under the cartel's supervision. Then came the military markers. Rifles once seen only in conflict zones overseas turned up within the same warehouses. Communications gear using encrypted signals was discovered tucked away inside standard shipping crates. Guard towers built at the perimeter of the sites layered 3 deep monitored entry points in a way that mirrored a forward outpost rather than a warehouse. The screening and securing of terrain, the use of layered defensive positions, and weapons of war indicated that this was no run-of-the-mill trafficking cell. It was a paramilitary infrastructure embedded in America's logistics backbone. As U.S. agencies reviewed the findings, one classification emerged. This wasn't merely organized crime, it was a threat to national security. The difference mattered. It meant that the network's purpose extended beyond illicit products. It could mobilize resources across state lines and perhaps internationally. That twist came when officials realized that one hub in Chicago was not just a storehouse. It was possibly the central transit node for a larger weapons and drug pipeline. The question loomed large. How had such a system grown within U.S. freight corridors without being detected until now? In breaking down the discovery phase, one fact stood out. The cartel had managed to integrate itself into the major transportation arteries of the United States, effectively co-opting the very infrastructure meant to move legitimate goods. Rail lines, trucking networks, and warehouse districts in and around Chicago became part of a hidden battlefield. The line between logistics for commerce and logistics for crime had blurred. So much so that federal agents had to update their playbook from drug bust to tactical incursion. At a time when many Americans thought of cartel threats as far away along the border, the real front line was inside the city, inside the distribution network they trusted. And this revelation forced the U.S. government to treat the network not just as a criminal enterprise, but as a destabilizing force with military-style capabilities operating in plain sight. The federal agents working this case watched silently, listening in on conversations that sounded more like insurgent briefings than gang chatter. Through intercepted wiretaps and covert field listening devices, they heard coded references to yards, rails, and cold bays, phrases that didn't match any ordinary drug deal. The intelligence teams realized they were not eavesdropping on a street corner gang, but on an organization operating with military precision inside America. In a suburban lab the size of a small industrial unit, technologists discovered methamphetamine with a level of purity that shattered domestic norms. Unlike typical street-grade meth, which might test at 60 to 70% purity, this product was manufactured at near-industrial standards, signaling that the operation had adopted advanced chemical engineering methodologies rather than the kitchen lab approach. The scale and quality of the output told investigators one thing: this was not a garage operation. It was a logistics-driven enterprise built for large volume production and distribution. Parallel to the chemical evidence, ballistics analysts traced rifle casings and spent rounds from Illinois to active conflict zones overseas. The flow of weapons was not one way. The Chicago region was emerging as a key node in a transnational arms pipeline. Federal reports show that Mexican cartels have long relied on smugglers buying U.S. firearms and shipping them across the border. Yet here in the Midwest, investigators found the reverse logic: weapons appearing in Chicago connected to broader international theaters. The revelation jolted the intelligence community. What if Chicago was not merely a destination, but a launch point? Agents working in the surveillance units concluded that to destroy this monster, the assault could not target a single point. They redesigned their playbook. 20 major nodes would have to be struck simultaneously. Rail yards, warehouse hubs, trucking depots, smuggling hide sites. The operation thus evolved into one of the largest multi-agency federated incursions in recent memory. What appeared at first as a drug raid now had the footprint of a military campaign. The U.S. government internally designated the threat as transnational with paramilitary characteristics. At that point, the classification shifted from organized crime to national security threat. The twist emerged when a covert federal ledger was uncovered, revealing Chicago as perhaps the primary weapons transport hub for a cartel network within the United States. Intelligence analysts who had mapped the routes found stop points, shell companies, and under-the-radar freight lines, all converging on the Chicago railroad corridor. The significance was stark. The operation was not just distributing narcotics, it was moving tools of war. With this confirmation, every tactical decision changed. The logistical tempo, resource deployment, and jurisdictional clearances mirrored those of counter-terror operations, rather than standard narcotics arrests. As the agents finalized their plan, one key question hung in the air. How deep did the network extend, and how much damage could it do if left unchecked? With the intelligence pointing to multiple states and international connections, the federal apparatus prepared for a strike, not only on the ground, but at the command structures behind the scenes. At exactly 4:42 a.m., the skies above Chicago erupted. A cordon of federal helicopters tilted into the darkness and flooded the rooftop of a vast warehouse district with fierce searchlights. Below, the engines of armored Bearcat vehicles roared as they rammed the main entrance of one of the cartel's strongest nodes. In this moment, the raid, codenamed Operation Steel Flood, shifted from intelligence tool to full-scale assault. Within seconds, sniper teams took position on adjacent rooftops. their scopes locked on armed sentries who thought they were still hidden in the pre-dawn murk. The guard towers, built like mini fortresses around what appeared to be a simple freight yard, revealed their true purpose. Agents watched as the cartel's lookouts raised their rifles, battle-grade weapons that even veterans later described as more military than criminal. The silent countdown ended when flashbang grenades exploded, white light filled the yard, and agents in full tactical gear swept in, wedges locking every corridor, every container bay. In Yards 14, a SWAT team hit an ambush zone, where cartel operatives, armed with rifle-style weapons, opened fire from behind shipping containers and rail siding cover. Bullets cracked, flashbangs detonated, and the assault went from planned to chaotic in an instant. Agents responding followed a standard flank breach formation. Teams moved through side corridors, secured rail-side access, and pushed into freezer-cold warehouses where illicit goods were stored. Flashbang grenades lit entire halls in white light, disorienting the defenders. Once windows were broken and doors were breached, agents moved with precision, sweeping through stacks of crates, scanning every nook. The cartel's defense was deep. Multiple layers of guards, camera systems, even sniper overwatch from higher vantage points. Yet within 11 minutes of the first breach, federal forces had taken control of the major access points. 73 armed suspects were subdued, disarmed, and handcuffed. The violent firefight at Yards 14 had cost the cartel the initiative. But the real breakthrough happened not on the loading docks, but in the basement of Warehouse 17. Agents discovered a secure, lead-lined chamber, stacked with crates marked only in code. Rail Unit 4, Transit Node B. Within those crates were crates of assault rifles, wrapped in oilcloth, their serial numbers ground away. Ballistics databases matched fragments of ammunition from those weapons to conflict zones overseas, indicating this facility was not simply moving drugs, it was moving weapons of war. A single rifle was traced to a conflict theater in Eastern Europe. At the same time, labs within the warehouse complex produced methamphetamine at such purity levels that experts said it exceeded street lab capability by a large margin. All of this evidence pointed at the same conclusion. The cartel infrastructure in Chicago had evolved far beyond trafficking. It now mirrored the operations of a militia. As rooftop snipers signaled the all clear and armored columns moved back through streets blocked by federal vehicles, agents reported over the radio that the target network had been disrupted and multiple sites were now secure. But even in the euphoria of success, one question lingered. Why did it take 11 minutes? The answer lay in the months of surveillance and intelligence work that had mapped every route, every guard shift, every crate movement. The cartel may have banked on being untouchable in the heart of America, but the feds had turned that assumption on its head. Federal officials later confirmed that more than 20 major nodes across the rail and road freight complex were struck nearly simultaneously, turning what looked like local warehouses into the center of a national battlefield. While precise numbers remained classified, the intensity of the raid drew comparisons to military operations overseas. The Department of Justice described the network as paramilitary in structure, transnational in reach, and tied to conflict zone weapon flows, a designation that flung this event into the realm of national security rather than ordinary crime. By dawn, the streets of Chicago's southwest industrial corridor were littered with evidence. Truck trailers seized, warehouses sealed, armed guards in handcuffs, crates opened and counted. For the first time, the infrastructure of a cartel operation was exposed in full daylight. Among the items cataloged were high-grade rifles, encrypted communication gear, and shipping manifests showing goods moving out of state and onto international ports. Yet for all the weapons and drug labs captured, the intelligence teams knew the battle was far from over. The dismantling of those sites may have uprooted the visible infrastructure, but the network's roots, its command nodes, its hidden financing, and its global supply chains remained. The question that still hung in the air wasn't how many arrests were made that night. It was how long until the cartel adapted and evolved again. In the dimly lit basement of Warehouse 17, federal agents discovered something that defied the usual definitions of a drug bust. Far beneath the concrete floor and shadowed freight containers, the space appeared less like a storage room and more like the logistical command center of an illegal army. Along a row of steel crates, rifles wrapped in oil-soaked cloth lay stacked, each one stripped of its serial numbers. Investigators noted that these weapons showed signs of prior combat deployment, metal fatigue, custom modifications, markings consistent with foreign arsenals. The discovery alone indicated that this operation extended well beyond Chicago's highways and rail yards. Next to the armory, technicians came across communication gear that had no retail equivalent. Encrypted radios, custom transmitters, tactical headsets, all clearly configured for operations more serious than street-level trafficking. The equipment was highly organized and encoded, which raised immediate alarm bells for the agents. As they moved further into the subterranean vault, they found rows of injection vials and sealed drums of fentanyl, manufactured not in a makeshift basement lab, but on something resembling an assembly line. The purity levels reported later by forensic labs reflected this industrial scale, indicating that the output of this site could support a trafficking operation of national magnitude. One rifle pulled from the stack turned the operation into a global wake-up call. Forensic tracing of its metal alloy and machining matched components known to have been used in a Middle East conflict zone, a fact that stunned the team. This link confirmed the intelligence agency's worst fears. The network operating out of Chicago was both a narcotics pipeline and a weapons conduit, weaponry intended for cross-border and overseas use. The ledger books, encrypted hard drives, and freight log maps that followed painted a picture of an organization with multi-continental reach. But the biggest revelation came when agents decrypted a set of ledger entries. The documents did not treat Chicago as a final destination. Instead, they listed the city as Transit Point 2. The primary node, Point 1, was left unnamed, but the context made it clear it was outside U.S. borders. Suddenly, Warehouse 17 was revealed not as a base, but as a waypoint. The scope of the mission shifted. This was a strategic hub in a network that stretched from the rails of Illinois to foreign battlefields. During the inspection, specialists paused to explain how these rifles were traced. By examining micro-etch serial fragments, machining marks on the alloy, and ballistic signatures, the Federal Bureau of Investigation linked weapons found in Chicago to incidents overseas. The process combined detailed metallurgical analysis with international ballistic databases, enabling the agents to follow a weapons path from assembly line to ammunition use abroad. That kind of trace work underscored how the operation in Chicago transcended local crime and touched national security. When the vault door finally closed behind the last forensic team, the true magnitude of what they had uncovered became apparent. Drug trafficking? Yes, but far more than that. A hybrid cartel militia operation with infrastructure, logistics, and global reach. This discovery in Warehouse 17 changed the nature of the response from how many kilos to what theaters are being armed. When dawn broke over Chicago, the full scale of the raid became clear. When those 1,600 federal agents hit 20 locations in a synchronized strike, they weren't targeting storefronts, they were sweeping out the core of a hardened network. More than 800 suspects were taken into custody, and among them roughly 600 were identified as key operatives of the cartel-style organization. These were not low-level couriers. They were the people running supply chains, guarding transport lines, issuing orders. The figure was confirmed in briefings released by law enforcement sources the next day. The locations targeted had been mapped months in advance, from reinforced warehouse complexes to hidden trucking depots and rail yards used as staging posts. Each site was neutralized with one objective: swift, overwhelming force. In federal parlance, the raids were described as quick, decisive, precisely coordinated. The agents moved in like special forces teams, striking enemy compounds, shutting down each node before the cartel could react. Once inside, the hall revealed the magnitude of what investigators were facing. Massive quantities of methamphetamine, whose purity levels dwarfed what street dealers usually sold, indicating production at an industrial scale rather than illicit backyard labs. Fentanyl in quantities large enough to threaten multiple states with overdose crises, confirming that these operations had become national in scope. Then there were the battlefield-grade weapons, not just handguns or smuggled rifles, but fully automatic military-style weapons and support equipment tied by ballistics back to conflict zones abroad. Also surrendered were suitcases full of cash, ledger books encrypted in multiple languages, shipping manifests listing rail points, trucking routes, and cross-border corridors. Prosecutors in Chicago's federal courthouse began to assemble what would become one of the largest racketeering and arms trafficking cases in U.S. history. Charges ranged from weapons smuggling and conspiracy to import, stock, and export of military-grade firearms, manufacturing and distribution of narcotics, money laundering, and participation in an enterprise that spanned state lines and national borders. According to government documents, the evidence collected included electronic logs, encrypted communications, and the physical hardware used to execute the logistics. But even as the major players were cuffed, the deeper question loomed. With 600 core members off the board, who would fill the vacuum? Criminal networks thrive on power vacuums. The moment those command centers are removed, other factions or rising stars try to move into the void. Federal agents recognized this risk from day one. They had to not only strike now, but plan to hold the space and prevent resurgence. Officials described the network as decapitated in the field, yet they emphasized that what remained could adapt. They warned that the same infrastructure might shift east or south, or that the weapons and routes already in motion would find new conduits. The message was clear. Dismantling the network is only the first step. Maintaining dominance and oversight is the long fight. There was an eerie confidence in the command room when officials reviewed the results. One mid-level agent, looking over photos of seized shipping crates and weapon racks, remarked that what they'd uncovered in Chicago had the footprint of a battlefield supply hub more than a drug bust. The records they pored over showed railcar logs altered to erase tracks, container tags changed mid-rail route, and ledger entries marking destinations overseas. Yet, even with tens of millions in cash seized and hundreds of firearms taken out of circulation, the operation's architects knew this. The night's work had disrupted, but not finished, the war. The surprise and speed of the raid delivered a blow, the lightning strike effect. But the real terrain ahead would involve intelligence operations, prosecutions, containment strategies, and monitoring of new routes. Now, one key question hung in the air. With the cartel's power structure fractured overnight, who would step up to claim its remnants? Would a splinter cell arise, more adaptable and less visible? Would an entirely new group emerge from the shadows? The answer would determine whether Chicago had won a battle or truly shifted the war. As the dust settled across Chicago's freight corridors, one truth became impossible to ignore. Operation Steel Flood showed exactly how the United States responds when a cartel stops behaving like a criminal group and begins operating like a paramilitary force. The scale alone proved it. In the space of a single morning, more than 1,600 federal agents moved across 20 hardened targets and took 800 suspects into custody, a figure later confirmed in federal press briefings released after the operation. Chicago, at least for now, was pulled back from a network that had embedded itself into the nation's supply chain. Yet the significance runs deeper than the numbers. Federal officials quoted by major outlets, including CBS News in their reporting on cartel logistics and weapons flow, have repeatedly warned that modern trafficking groups evolve fast, using industrial methods and cross-border networks that mimic the structure of armed organizations. That is why the U.S. response looked less like a traditional raid and more like a coordinated special operations strike. And although the operation delivered a decisive blow, the long fight is only beginning. According to security analysts cited in multiple national reports, maintaining a sustained federal presence is essential to prevent new factions from filling the vacuum left behind. Now, a larger question sits over the city. Will this takedown fracture the cartel beyond repair? Or will the organization reshape itself into something even more elusive? If you want to follow the hidden battles unfolding inside America's borders, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Military Power, because what comes next may change how you see the entire war playing out.